Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar with HRLocker and theyre HRM. We're delighted to have everybody with us today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Christelle Rinn, and I am the CMO here at HRLocker. One of the things that we've been noticing the last couple of months, since we're almost getting back to normal, is there's a lot of change in the HR role in the industry itself. So we wanted to get on somebody who, I suppose, had a lot of experience in that HR role and who's able to talk to us about the current trends that are happening and also how to manage that return to the workplace over the next few months with the opening of the workplace. So today we have Derek McKay with us from theyre Human Resource Management. So Derek, we're delighted to have you with us today. Derek, if you could introduce yourself to everybody.
Yeah, good morning, everyone, and thanks, Christelle, for the opportunity this morning. So I'm Derek McKay, Director with theyre Human Resource Management. So our job is to advise organisations on all aspects of HR, employment law and health and safety. And I think today is a very timely discussion and presentation to have, given I'm sure that the volume of questions and queries that clients have at this moment in time.
Yeah, so we'll just go through the agenda there briefly, and just for people who haven't been on the webinars before, I have the lovely Jenny with me today, who will be manning the questions and answers session. So as we go through the presentation, if anybody has any questions, we're delighted to go through them. So just put the question into the questions and answer session, and we'll try to address as many questions as possible, either throughout the webinar or certainly at the end when we'll have the dedicated question and answer session. But if there is something, if we're going through one of the agenda items and you do have a question, just put the question there, and hopefully we'll be able to answer it for you. So in terms of the agenda, we've 5 key areas that we're going to go through. There's a lot to go through. So Derek, I suppose we'll start with you on the first slide there.
Great. Yeah, well, look, I think obviously there's a huge amount of discussion at the moment in terms of organisations returning to the workplace, particularly obviously the office-based organisations. So really just, I suppose, to highlight a couple of key points for consideration and for planning from every organisation's perspective, whether it's their entire office or whether it's the support staff in their organisation, if they're in manufacturing, etc. So the main thing, I suppose, at this moment in time is just a reminder that like the current restrictions and guidelines, the return to work safety protocols are still in place. And I know there's quite a bit of a catalyst out there at the moment for people to try and get back into offices at the moment. But the protocols are still in place, which do recommend that where possible, employees still work remotely. And as has been indicated, it's expected in August, kind of going forward, that there will be some easings of those restrictions and changing of the guidelines that may very much allow organisations, I suppose, greater control over their destiny around working practices. And that's why I think the next few points are key for organisations to consider. Now is the time for organisations to be preparing for these sort of the different scenarios as to how they're going to return people to the workplace. I suppose the first question is, are they planning to return people to the workplace, or are they considering a remote working environment? And experience is telling us there's very, very small proportion of organisations who are taking this opportunity to go fully remote at this moment in time. But organisations should look at all the scenarios and do it now before it comes to time where there's a changing of restrictions, and consider the different things that need to be discussed with employees. Employees are thinking about these questions at the moment. So I put there about what's your approach and communicating that with the employees and having those discussions to understand what the organisation's requirements are and what the employee preferences are. A key point for me, and I think it is fair to say that not all jobs can be done remotely. There's absolutely certain jobs that I think everyone would agree require a physical presence, be it in the services sector and other jobs. So there are considerations around remote working, hybrid working, but essentially saying that organisations should consider increased levels of flexibility at this moment in time. Now is an opportune time for organisations to consider what would be the appropriate way of looking at a newer way of working on a more established or permanent basis when these protocols and restrictions ease. So we'll see then on the next slide, what I've referenced though as well is important is that the start of the year, the government did communicate out its commitment to remote working across the country and it being a permanent fixture in the workplace. So regardless of what the organisation's plans are, there is intended legislation to be introduced in the second half of the year about remote working that will give employees the right to request remote working, not the right to remote working, the right to request remote working. So it is something to have the antenna up for, to wait for the legislation to come into force. And what we're hoping is that there will be clarity on what those obligations are and how employers deal with any such requests arising out of that. So it is to have that whilst you're thinking now as to how we might bring people back to the workplace and what sort of format. There's going to be an element of legislation underpinning that later on during the year. So it's just to have that to the fore for people's minds as well. And then on the next slide, what I talk about is the key considerations for organisations around remote working, hybrid working, whatever version of working that organisations are looking at. And we do say, look, don't sleepwalk into a working arrangement that doesn't suit the business. You have to clearly articulate what those business needs are. You know, if your phones need to be answered from 9 to 5 and cover needs to be provided even on site, these are some of the needs that are very clear that need to be managed. Other organisations might have much greater flexibility. Manufacturing organisations have shift patterns that are fixed. They're going to continue on with those. So these are some of the considerations that should be looked at. Understand what the employee preferences are. Employees might want to say, well, actually, I do want to come back to the office, but if possible, I'd like to come back 3 days or 4 days a week. And understanding what those preferences are and can those preferences be met, aligned to the business needs. You can pilot any such scenario. You can say, well, look, between August and December or for the next 6 months, let's put it in place to see, does it work for you? Does it work for the business? And do capture that in writing and confirm it's for a fixed period of time, and that it isn't a permanent change to employees' terms and conditions. You know, at that moment, if you are piloting something, but on the longer term, yes, you will have to consider if you are changing someone's terms and conditions to being as much home-based or remote-based as office, you do want that confirmed in writing and as with any change to terms and conditions signed by both parties. Do consider health and safety. That should have been a consideration for the last 15, 16 months. Same too with GDPR and the whole area of data protection. And the whole area of costs, both for an employer and employee, is coming to the fore again in terms of potential the next budget discussion and in relation to the whole area of remote working legislation. So there might be further clarity on that. So there's quite a number of considerations around that I know from talking with Christelle and talking with clients as well. A lot of questions are arising as what can we do, what can't we do, or what should we do? So there's questions coming in.
I think, Derek, the key thing that we discussed with is that, yes, we're waiting on clarity in terms of when offices are going to be reopening and when we can bring people back to the workforce. But I mean, from talking to you, what's most important is that we're not waiting for that green light, that we're putting some kind of strategy in place now that we know is going to suit our business in terms of, like you said, if you actually need cover in the office, that you're discussing that with your employees at this stage, that you're discussing with employees how a post-COVID workplace is going to operate in the company.
Yeah, oh, it's huge. Like the employees are looking for, even if you haven't made a decision, communicate that it's under consideration and that there will be further discussions around it. So communication is going to be key around this to allow employees to start planning in their own mind whatever that return might be to the workplace, because people will be making some of their own decisions as well. And there is discussion around pent up employee turnover. Yeah. So if an employee says, well, I don't think my employer is going to give me a bit of flexibility, but I know organisation B down the road will, in the absence of that clarity from their employer, I do think there's a risk that employees will start to move, which is obviously to the detriment of a business.
I think as well. Yeah. We've two questions here that I'll go through with you, Derek, is regarding to a pilot. Has the fact that we've all been working from home, does that classify as a pilot in itself for the last 12 to 15 months?
Yeah, I think it's been an experience to allow you to understand what works and what doesn't work, but it was a forced experience for most organizations. And it wasn't a permanent, well, in my experience, most organizations, it wasn't a permanent planned change to T's and C's. So yes, you'd be perfectly within your right to say, once there's an easing of restrictions and an organization has control over the workplace fully, I suppose, and whatever safety measures are in place, they can absolutely to say, well, now we're going to pilot it on a X amount of basis in a formal capacity. Yeah. And I think that's, some organizations might need to do that because they might feel that the previous experience has allowed them to understand what's working and what's not. But some organizations definitely will formally pilot it.
Yeah, and I think as well that the last kind of, what are we now, in 15 to 16 months, it has been remote working, but I mean, people have been homeschooling at home as well. There hasn't been permanent structures in terms of home offices and things like that. So it was emergency remote working rather than to planned remote working, right?
It is. And I think even some demands on the business were different because their clients maybe weren't fully operational. So we haven't been working in even economic wise as would be the normal way of working. So I agree completely that it isn't a normal situation. We're trying to normalize now a newer way of working and find out what's that optimum way of working.
Yeah. The next question here, Jeffrey, is will it be mandatory for employment contracts to have details of remote working?
We would expect that through the legislation, there's going to be a certain amount of clarity provided as to what an organisation must do in terms of considering remote working. So I think any organisation that is considering remote working, even in the absence of the legislation, we would say have a remote working policy in place, absolutely, to think through the different scenarios, as I mentioned earlier. And again, what is that person's place of work? At the moment, obviously, it can be twofold, the office and the home environment. That brings about questions, everything about clarity of expectations. Are they expected to be at their home desk from 9 to 5, similar as if they're in the office 9 to 5? So use that remote working policy to provide the clarity that I do think is important for employees and employers. And what I'd really want for employers and employees is to agree that remote working, employment relationships built on trust, and so too is remote working. And there has to be that element of trust between both parties going in there, that employers aren't overly monitoring what an employee is doing, and ultimately an employee is just doing what they're meant to be doing during the working day. It breaks it down as being that simple.
Yeah, absolutely. And I definitely think it is something that I'm presuming that nobody has really changed contracts for the last 12 months to put in remote working, whereas now it is something that you should be looking at doing if you're going to be deciding on that hybrid working or that full remote, whatever it is. Then it is something which is actually somewhat tied to the next question is, so will there be employers' mandatory duties in terms of remote work, like providing office equipment and furniture? So I suppose that's kind of linked to the health and safety side of it.
Yeah, so the answer is that's not changed from what it is now, that an employer is required to provide the suitable facilities for an employee to work safely, whether that's at home or in the office. So a lot of organizations would have, the keyboard, the mouse, the screen, laptop, and the work chair has been, I suppose, the minimal things that employers would have provided for an ergonomically safe work environment. And they should carry out that DSE ergonomics assessment as well on the home environment, which can be done remotely as a tool under the guidance of a health and safety practitioner. And again, it's something we can do for organizations. But, they don't necessarily have to provide a desk. They don't have to provide it's not defined what they have to provide, but it covers what is reasonable to provide that safe place of work. And this is where a policy would be important to actually now get to do. What is that natural setup for someone in that work environment if they're going to be remote working?
And I suppose that really comes down to then as well, that employee communication side of it, both from a recruitment side, but also from your current employees, is that, what is their setup at home for remote working?
Exactly. And whilst no one wants to be intrusive into someone's circumstances, you do want someone to have a suitable workspace at home. if they're on calls such as this, you know, you don't want that other people are available to listen in if you have documents out from a GDPR perspective or open, or your PC open. So yes, we would see it that organisations will be saying that the person should have a suitably quiet or bright, you know, whatever their preferences are for a suitable workspace. Not necessarily, you know, they have to go off and have their own, you know, dedicated office, but it has to be a suitable workspace. And we know sitting at the kitchen table on a kitchen chair is not suitable.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's something that if hasn't been addressed, it's important to be addressing if you're going down the remote work.
Oh, like there's been, I'm going to say, leeway provided, or, you know, there hasn't been as much focus because of all the other circumstances employers and employees have been under. But, you know, that runway now, we're out of runway on that. Organizations are out of runway. You can't 14, 16 months later still say I haven't had the opportunity to assess the workspace for my employees who are sitting at home. That arguably ran out 2-3 months into the pandemic, you know, and particularly then if you're putting a remote policy in place, it should be not just the safety part, but the well-being part, which I know we'll touch upon in a minute, should feature highly in your policy, because isolation and other challenges for working from home we know are present as well. So any policy should be robust enough to address these matters in a holistic approach, rather than hoping that they're not going to come up or be discussed. So there can be absolutely a cost to employers to have a person set up appropriately in their home environment.
Yeah. So another question here, which is quite interesting, Derek, is do you think we will see a shift in pay based on working from home and the savings against office working in the future?
Yeah, I love the question. And years ago, there used to be a premium for working in Dublin. So at one stage, I think that the argument against it is it's the same work. You know, and does it matter that the person is able to do it from one place over the other? So there's definitely an equity argument to say, you know, doesn't matter where you're working, where you're based, be it Sligo, Dublin, Cork, wherever, it doesn't matter. Equally, then you have announcements going out, you know, from major American banks saying if you want a New York salary, you better be working in the New York office, because the cost of living is higher in New York than, I don't know, Cincinnati or wherever else. So I do think it's going to come up. But equally, I think where it might evolve is that an employee might be more inclined to accept an offer if they have other, I suppose, they might not compromise, is probably the wrong word, but they might be a bit more flexible on the salary expectations if other elements of their needs are being met, because they're prioritizing their work-life integration, they're prioritizing the time that they don't have to travel, the cost of travel, and all those areas. So it's very much the next 6 to 18 months, I think, are going to be more interesting from a HR perspective, because now we're going to be making decisions that we have to make. To date, we've been nearly implementing decisions that we had to implement. So I think it's going to be a completely different focus.
Yeah, and I'd agree. Over the next couple of months, we're just going to see a lot more of it, and it is I suppose addressing the issue rather than just ignoring it. We're just going to do one more question, and then we'll go through the slides again. Is we're adding an addendum to the contract with employees opting to choose office, home, or 100% remote. Is this okay instead of issuing new contracts?
Yes, as short it is. If it's amending the statement of terms and conditions, it should be just very clear on what it is and having both parties signing it. But if someone's been given the, you know, remote working in full, again, what's your remote working policy? Because that becomes their place of work. And this is where I talked about the scenarios earlier. So if that person's required to attend a meeting in the Dublin office and they've moved to Cork because they're a remote worker, are they now getting paid for the travel time and the travel to go to Dublin? And these are all the scenarios that need to be kind of teased out in terms of, have you thought through this? And can that person refuse to attend a meeting because they're saying, well, I'm a remote worker, so why would I attend a meeting? So it's important that understanding those business needs are captured in any policy. So if you are changing your terms and conditions on a permanent basis for employees, you have put the parameters of those changes in a policy that accompanies that they may be required to attend a meeting twice a month on site, or whatever, or as reasonably required, whatever those requests are. But this is where sometimes the pilot works as well, to tease some of these scenarios out. But definitely, put it in writing, whatever those changes are, and have signed by both parties.
Yeah. And actually, that's a good point in regard to the expenses side of it, is that if somebody now, for example, like I said, lives in Cork now, and they're visiting a site visit in Dublin, for example, previously you would have paid expenses from your Dublin office to your Dublin client.
Exactly.
Are you now paying expenses from Cork to Dublin, which is something that has to go into your remote working policy, right?
Yeah, and we would expect that there will be further kind of iterations through revenue and or the remote working legislation to start teasing out some of the things around expenses and all the rest. So yeah, this is why I think as we go forward now, there'll be as many questions as there has been in the past, but just a new iteration of questions, new set of questions.
Yeah, no, and I definitely think from all of this, the key thing is that, yes, we're waiting on government guidelines and all that kind of thing, but now is the time to be putting the things in place, or just piloting things, or talking to your employees to figure out what they want to do, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, because the employees are thinking about it. They're thinking, will I have, if I haven't been in the office for 16 months, am I expected to come back in August, or how much notice am I getting? Am I coming back full time, or do I get to do a certain number of days? So it's to get ahead of the communications. Don't let employees fill the gap with what they're assuming, or worse still, assume there's going to be no flexibility and decide to make a different career decision.
Yeah, which is important. We'll move to the next slide, Derek. There.
Right. Okay. So some of the considerations around the safe working practice, and at the moment we're working off ultimately probably a soft, if we call it that, return to the workplace for those who haven't been in the workplace in August, potentially September, and just some key considerations. So for those on site, and we'd seen it last year to a point in between some of the lockdowns, when there was a lifting of restrictions or an easing of restrictions, certain organizations were working off rota systems, so they weren't bringing everybody back in the same time. They had either teams working together or team A, team B, really just again to manage the flow of people through the business, to make sure their systems are up and working from a health and safety perspective, to reduce the risk from a health and safety perspective, that if there was a suspected case, at least it was confined as well. So these are considerations there, staggered breaks, visitor protocols. Having all these in place is absolutely fundamental before you start informing people, if that is the case, that they're coming back to the office. So those work safely protocols, we're on the third iteration of the work safely protocols from government. May 2021 is the most recent version. So that is important for people to understand the most recent version of those. And essentially it's still including, social distancing, wearing masks in public places, washing hands, all the protocols that are there. And it's talked about antigen testing for the first time from employers' consideration. So there's a couple of new things in there in the most recent version, but ultimately the fundamentals remain in place. Employers are required to have updated their safety statement with a COVID risk assessment, have lead workers within the workplace who are trained, have staff inducted about COVID and the risks, have their first aid responders updated and trained on COVID as well, and really have carried out a COVID risk assessment within the business. That's been in place now for 12 plus months. So just reminding people of that as well. But what's an important one as well, we've seen now come into April, is the right to disconnect legislation, the code of practice issued on the 1st of April around that. And that does feature around the employee well-being and health and safety, that people working remotely, the signs that people are finding it harder to turn off or working longer hours because they're out of their normal office-based routine. So if you haven't yet looked at the right to disconnect legislation or code of practice, do have a look at it. Happy to talk to people around it as well. For the remote workers, do remind people about taking rest breaks and all that sort of stuff. That's always been in place anyway, but you need to, I would say, re-emphasize it and actually make sure it's happening, and using the software to capture people's taking breaks, is required. I know when I go down to WRC to represent organizations to defend claims about working time, I look for the records to show have they taken their breaks and been given sufficient breaks. So making sure you're using the technology that's in place with HRLocker to be able to do that. Communicate about remote working practices, expectations. Do have regular one-to-ones, not just phoning them to say, well, where are you with that piece of work? Have to take the time to see how people are getting on, because it's harder, and I've found it harder to understand how people are in general, because you don't see them every single day as you would in the office. So do have the extra bit of time on a one-to-one basis to understand how people are getting on in a remote setting. And this might influence some of your thinking about a blended hybrid approach in the future as well. So they're just some of the key considerations. The next slide that I put up is about the whole area though of vaccinations, because we've been inundated with questions around it. So I've just put up 4 questions. Can you encourage employees to be vaccinated? The answer is yes. Government guidelines are out there. You can share that with employees. You can tell employees that this information is out there. In fact, you can say, well, if someone's going to get vaccinated, you can take time out during the working day to go get vaccinated. And if they're feeling unwell afterwards, that they're not going to be at a financial disadvantage from pay, if that's the case. So that's not legally required, but employers can do that. And a lot of employers have done that to encourage an uptake of vaccination. Can you require an employee to be vaccinated? The short answer is no. You can't force someone to be vaccinated. It's their decision, and it can be on many grounds: religious grounds, health grounds, various different grounds that are there. So you can't force someone. And can you ask employees that have been vaccinated or inform other employees? And we've seen questions arise where people are saying, well, if I'll come back to work if you can tell me all my colleagues have been vaccinated. So in the last week or so, the Data Protection Commission have finally issued something out in relation to clarification around kind of GDPR in this area, and I'm happy to share it out as well. But just, I suppose, to take the quote out of it here, and I'll just read it verbatim, is that in the absence of clear advice from public health authorities in Ireland, that it is necessary for employers and managers of workplaces to establish vaccination status of employees and workers. The processing of vaccine data is likely to represent unnecessary and excessive data collection. So basically it's saying, what reason do you have to collect this information on employees? And there's only going to be a very small handful of reasons that an employer has the reason to know this information. And more so frontline workers, there's some consideration around that. But there has been guidance finally provided in that area. It's the message we have been providing for the last few months in this area as well. So it is a case of tread carefully, depending on the services that you provide, the environment that you're in. But it also confirms that vaccination is only one element of this. Wearing masks, washing hands, all the other preventative measures are in place. So you don't even rely on vaccination. You rely on the totality of all the health and safety measures that are considered. So I know there's usually a lot of consideration around this in questions. So they're just some key points for employers.
Yeah, Derek, I think that the key thing around the vaccination side of it is that even if you have your entire staff base vaccinated, that doesn't mean that you don't get to still put in the health and safety guidelines.
Oh, absolutely. The health and safety guidelines are non-negotiable. Yeah. Ultimately, what it might give rise to for an employer is they might, in their risk assessment, if we call it that, there might be a little lesser risk if all employees are vaccinated. But again, they might know if all employees are vaccinated. Yes. And in a traditional office, I can see a set of circumstances where they could inquire and process that data as to that vaccination status. Now, on the positive side, I think a lot of people are openly sharing their information or saying, look, I'm not going to be around at 4 o'clock, I have to go get vaccinated, and saying, great, best of luck, let me know that you're okay. So there has been a great openness, I think, around it. But of course, there's going to be a cohort of people who just will prefer not to share their status, and they're entitled ultimately to do so.
And I think one of the very positive things that I've seen with companies, and I think it's most companies are doing it in that, if you've got your appointment for your vaccine, you can take the time off work. And like that you said, that if you're sick a day or two afterwards, that's okay too.
Yeah, I think it's just a reasonable common sense approach by employers to allow us to get back to a level of new normality in the future. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have a few questions here. Some are still leading on from the remote working side of it. We'll stick in there anyways. So the right to request remote work will take another while to be approved, but the return to the office will be sooner than that. So for now, we could at least have policies, but not yet changes or addendums to the contracts. That goes down to your piloting, maybe.
Yeah, like absolutely. You decide on, so whilst the legislation will come into place, you have to make decisions on what you know now. And if it is that you're intending to allow certain roles the ability to remote work or hybrid work, then you confirm that in writing. If that is for a defined period of time, you confirm that in writing and you revisit it at that time. You may need to revisit it earlier if the legislation comes into place and people are officially requesting clarification on that right to request right to remote work on a more ongoing basis.
Yeah. So if we change terms and conditions to hybrid working, where is the place of work to be? Will this mean that the person is home-based?
Again, yeah, I love the questions because these are all the things we're talking about.
Like, we like to put you under pressure, Derek.
And I suppose there's a couple of elements to this, and it's not that there's not a direct answer. Their place of work is wherever they're sitting at that moment in time, because by committing to hybrid working, we're saying you will be based in the office for certain days and you'll be based remote working for certain days. And those remote working can be at home, could be in a hub in Portlaoise, it could be in a different place. It just won't be in the office. So your duty of care to that employee is in their place of work, wherever that may be. Where there's probably going to need to be clarification for things around expenses and things like that. Like at the moment, Revenue are very clear on, you can't claim expenses to attend work. So, at the moment I drive to work, I can't claim mileage for that. But all of a sudden, if I have different places of work, then at what point does that differ? So I think that clarification is going to be needed to happen later this year. So I think what we would be saying is the employee's place of work is where they're working at that moment in time. And the revenue rules can apply if someone has to travel for work. They usually travel from the shortest distance, either from the workplace or their home. So that still applies as a revenue guideline. And that's just purely for expenses. But everything else will apply to their workplace, be it remote or in the office.
And I think that's the key. It's mostly around the expenses side of it, because regardless of if you've got that hybrid working policy in place, if the person's in the office or at home, your health and safety matters still stand.
Yeah, organizations now have an expanded health and safety policy that they hadn't got before. And it's not overly cumbersome if you get the structure in place. You do your DSE systems online, you get it reviewed, and you retain those, no different than you would if you did the DSE ergonomics in the office.
Yeah. So another question there for you, Derek, is it okay to provide, this is all down to remote working and allowances, sorry. Is it okay to provide an allowance to employees to set up their home environment for working from home? What would be an acceptable allowance to provide, and are there tax implications for the employee?
Yeah, I'll have to caveat that in terms of, tax advice and revenue advice. My understanding is that because an organization has to provide the equipment and safe place of work to get set up, that's, I suppose, an obligation, and you wouldn't be charging an employee for that. So whether it is that I'm saying, I will give you a chair, or whether you buy a chair and expense that chair back, either way, I would see as being acceptable. I think, again, common sense would say, what's a budget, an acceptable budget for a chair, that people aren't going out and it has to be a suitable work chair which can go up and down, back and forth with the adjustables, so you just put parameters around that. So if you work off the premise that if it's required equipment to carry out their job, my understanding is that there's no tax implications. It should be receipted, it should be clear in the policy, and most organizations have an accountant or an advisor in that area. Just double check.
Yeah, and then if you're building an extension on the side of someone's house, maybe double check that.
It's probably you're pushing the boundaries a little, or if your chair is an armchair, you're kind of going, I'm not sure that's a work chair. But yeah, look, common sense I think prevails in a lot of that circumstances. But yeah, again, this is where a robust enough, straightforward policy on what you provide as an employer, or if it makes more common sense, we don't want to courier a chair down to our employee in Kerry they buy a chair locally and have delivered, and it just gets even invoiced directly to the company because it's office equipment.
Yeah, exactly. The next question is for me, it's why are HR software providers offering vaccination tracking systems? So, for ourselves, we have a number of clients who have frontline workers, and they're recording it from I suppose, because they are booking the appointments for people and trying to get people as many people vaccinated, and it's a way for them to record how many people who do they need to book for the next round of vaccinations. And like that, we would absolutely take Derek's advice on board in that if you do not have a legitimate reason to be collecting that data, don't turn the module on.
Yeah,
and that's the reason why we're not charging for it as well. Sorry.
Yeah, and the data protection commissioner did say that like there are situations such as frontline workers where vaccination could be considered a necessary safety measure, that you could lawfully process that data, because so there are situations, I suppose they're lesser than in the norm. So you're right, people can turn off, don't use it unnecessarily, that function, but it is relevant for certain organizations. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think that the key thing there is, and I think we're going to be hearing so much of this down the line, is that at the moment, no company can force that information from people and stop people coming in. And that actually pertains to this next question, Derek, is if you can't ask an employee if they have been vaccinated, or if the employee prefers not to give that information, does that mean that masks, etc., have to be worn in the office?
So the guidance for masks, etc., still remains in place, really, regardless of the vaccination status. What we see is that where there's common areas, masks are what's been recommended, or where you're unable to provide the distance between desks, etc. So there's a number of factors: how ventilated the room is, how large the room, how many employees, where the common areas are. So unfortunately, it's not a black and white answer, but all the other protocols, regardless of vaccination, should still remain in force, from having available the sanitizers, having cleaners coming in appropriately, and making sure that the areas around are sufficiently cleaned, etc.
Yeah. And I think that's the key thing. Forget about the vaccination side of it. Keep your health and safety protocol in place.
Absolutely, yeah.
And just one more question there before we move on, Derek, is if some staff continue to work from home, is the employer obliged to pay towards the light and heating and Wi-Fi costs? I know Revenue said they pay approximately €3 or some figure like that per week, but that won't necessarily cover costs.
Yeah, so at the moment, no, there's no obligation. That employers can pay $320 per day as an amount to an employee that has that isn't taxable, but that isn't a requirement. But the employee can offset some of their tax directly with Revenue, in terms of light, heat, broadband bills and stuff like that. So the employee can get an element of a tax break on that, is one element. An employer can pay $320 a day if they so wish. I would expect that that's one of the areas in particular that is being looked at later on this year, between the new budget in October and linking in with the legislation and remote working as well. Yeah,
because it was a minority before, whereas now it's come to the fore.
It's come to the fore, but majority of employers still aren't paying it, is our experience, and that's just because it is a direct cost. And a lot of employers are arguing, I still have the cost at the office, I just don't have people in there. I still have my rent, my insurance and all that area. And this is where how we normalise the new working environment will make it interesting, that employers will find their new model of working. And I know some employers have reduced their office space, and that means they've made some savings there. Whether or not they use some of that in the other arena to support the remote working environment is still, I think, to be seen.
Great. Okay, we'll just move on to the next slide.
Yeah, it's conscious of a few more slides. So look, health and well-being is an area that we really want to make sure employers have it as high on the agenda as they do health and safety. And government has pushed it. It's in the return to work safely protocols, and even the surveys we do, it's coming up as one of the most significant areas on the HR agenda, which is great to see. So we see return to work safety protocols. They did look and recommend use of an employee assistance program, because we know the change in routine, different external pressures on people has had its toll and is having its toll. We know the whole area of mental health, unfortunately, is giving rise to more challenges for individuals. So organisations can proactively share information, partner with occupational health providers, partner with some of the great charities in this area to share that information and support employees. As always, manage absenteeism, and there's a mix of information out there that we don't know. Are people sick because they're not telling us, because they're behind a screen and they might be, not informing us if they've been absent? Or in other cases, people are being absent or are absent, but it's less likely to understand why they're absent. So there's a lot of questions around absenteeism, where that'll be in the future. As always, keep your policies updated. Updating vulnerable employees, and that can be that you've seen a change in their approach. You've seen a change in how they engage with you. So be proactive as the line manager or the HR practitioner to have a discussion. And if you have an EAP in place, that's what it's there for as well, to support. Look at how you can continually engage employees. The last 16 months, we've had to be innovative to engage employees on an ongoing basis, that certain things had to run its course and we're on to the next set of tools to continue to engage. We've always said it, you overly communicate in times of remote working, and where there's training needed for managers to more effectively manage and lead in a hybrid or remote environment, to do so, but do so with a health and well-being agenda in mind as well. Don't just assume everyone's okay because they haven't told you that they're not. And managers need to get more comfortable in that space, and you can train managers in that area to be more aware of the whole area of health and well-being and more comfortable in that space. Yeah. And then really the final part, I know, Christoph, we were talking about this at length, about where's this moving to. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of organisations and HR practitioners haven't really grasped the need now to start looking ahead, that we're and looking further ahead, more so than looking ahead. We're waiting to get return to work protocols and health and safety, but there's a lot of change ahead, I would argue, in the future. And looking at the future of work line, it's not the future of work, it's the future of work is now. So changing practices, changing employee expectations are all happening now, or arguably have happened. We're just having now to discuss them more. So look through that future of work lens and see what's the impact and the opportunity from a value-driven HR perspective. What are the most appropriate metrics to measure now that you mightn't have measured before? And I know people measure traditional measurements of employee turnover and absenteeism, but now I think engagement is huge, such an important measure to look at more than ever. The equality, diversity and inclusion agenda has increased, I would argue, over the last 12 to 18 months, which is really positive from that perspective. But it's not just about measuring your level of diversity, it's improving on your inclusiveness in the workplace. And the whole area of remote work and hybrid working, all that has lent to not just, I suppose I call it local and global mobility, that people now could take a job that they wouldn't have taken before because they're able to do it remotely or in a hybrid version. So all of a sudden that's an opportunity and a threat for organisations, that they've a greater pool of employees or candidates to access, but equally that makes their team more accessible to organisations that traditionally people mightn't have left to go to because of location. So these are just some of the areas. I suppose we could spend an afternoon talking about this, but it's really just to put on people's radar, not just focus on the weeks and months that are in front of you. I'm saying focus in on 2022 at least, and what needs to be happening, and be working on those plans now and start implementing some of them.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree with you more, Derek, in terms of the future of work. We need to stop thinking that it's happening in 2022. It's here today. It's something we need to be planning for now. And just in terms of the metrics, so we do have a download that we'll send out at the end of the webinar with a copy of the webinar as well, in terms of some of those key metrics that we've identified. But really important that you're looking at your own company, what you need to measure internally. And this doesn't mean you need to go on and do some fancy Power BI reporting and things like that. A lot of the tools that we're currently using, like Microsoft Teams or even just your Microsoft or your HR software or anything like that, there are reports there that you can start getting some good data from to see are your employees engaged and things like that? And then one last thing before I take the next question is, I couldn't agree with you more in terms of the ED&I, is that, of course, we're measuring diversity constantly, but sometimes people forget about, it's not just about measuring the diversity, it's actually putting in place the inclusion side of it, which is more important.
Yeah, and again, just in terms of updates, the HSA released an update recently about employing people with disabilities. So I know we've issued a good article out on it, and we can share it again with people on the call. But it's a very practical approach, because I think sometimes people are afraid to ask some of the questions.
Yes.
Either offending a candidate for employment or an employee. So from that perspective, it really lends to helping employers bring up to the subject of disability, and because not all disabilities are physical, so you don't even see them. So it's a good new guidance. It hadn't been updated in the last 10, 12 years, so it's a new update.
That's great. We'll include that link, to the.
And it does talk about inclusiveness with people with disabilities, so that's why it just prompted me. It's again, it's taking sometimes the unknown out of it, and being able to say, yes, this is a healthy conversation to have, because it's through the lens of inclusiveness, and particularly from a safety perspective, and inclusiveness, to make sure that we don't overlook something in terms of that person. Yeah.
So one last question, and again, if anybody asks us, I'm just a bit conscious of time, but
of course
we'll go to the question is, can you ask staff anonymously if they're vaccinated, so at least you can see kind of the percentage in the workforce?
I suppose you can ask. I'd rephrase that to say, would I be encouraging organisations to do it? And I wouldn't be, to be honest, because I suppose, like, we do employee surveys and things like that, and they are anonymous, because clients, we would do it anonymously on their behalf, and there's always a cohort of people that would be potentially think, well, the link I clicked on could be tracked through a website back to my computer and things like that. So again, I wouldn't be encouraging organisations to do it, because it gives rise to a set of questions that inevitably probably all employees won't fill it out anyway, so you're not going to get full data. And will people fill it out honestly? Most probably will. And what are you going to use that data for? And if it's saying, well, 70% of people said they're vaccinated, but only 50% of people filled in the survey, you don't really have real data to make an informed decision on. Allow your health and safety risk assessment to make those decisions as to the level of risk in the workplace, and not rely on potentially an ill-informed set of data.
And I would agree with you, is that the person who was never going to tell you to begin with isn't going to tell you anonymously anyway. So,
and in fact, it gives rise to sometimes I don't think it's appropriate that you ask me, because you're putting me in a position to answer. So I don't think it's the way forward. I can understand the rationale to want to know, and it is coming from a good place to provide that safe place of work. Everything's telling us you can provide that safe place of work through the established mechanisms that are already there, and vaccination doesn't overturn that.
Yeah, it's not key to that back to work.
No, unless it's frontline workers, something along those lines in other areas. No, not so much.
Yeah. Okay, we've just two more questions there, Derek, and then we might end it after that. And if anybody has any other questions, you can drop it into an email. I'm just conscious of the time. Is if some employees, I've already read that question. Is can you set a protocol around Teams as part of a remote working policy? Like, can you enforce use of cameras on calls?
I think these are important things, yes, that should be discussed. That I think there might be limited circumstances that an employee mightn't use Teams, and one such scenario is that people who are visually impaired, and we talked about an inclusive workplace, that they don't have the same opportunity to see people on obviously Teams as such. Now, I think that's limited again for a lot of employers, but it wouldn't be unusual that employers would say that it is our practice that people would be on camera, and for the right reasons. It's not that I want to see where you're working. It is that it enables better engagement and to understand, well, actually, I can see, Chriselle saying, actually, I've got a question, all this sort of stuff as well. So if it's done from the right reasons, you could encourage the protocol, if we call protocols or practices around that. Yes, if there are legitimate grounds for why you wouldn't do it. Like anything, understand what the grounds are or understand what the objections. If the objection is, I just don't want to, I personally, from an HR perspective, I wouldn't see that being as reasonable as the employer saying, I would much prefer us all to be on that. We don't see each other day in, day out. This is our opportunity to engage in a more meaningful way.
Yeah, and actually, just as it's a little bit related to that question, is there is some great reporting within Microsoft Teams, not reading people's messages or listening to people's calls, but there's some great reporting to see, if people were engaging a lot in the social channels or engaging a lot in conversations with people, and then all of a sudden it's kind of dropped off. That maybe that's a huge indicator of in terms of employee engagement, or why is that person stopped engaging with the rest of, are they going through something, or should the manager reach out or something like that, or even from a call perspective, if you have a sales team and one person is making 100 calls a day on Teams and the other person is making 5, is it because they have a problem with their broadband, or maybe it's not, because we can't jump to the conclusion that it's not because they're not doing their job, it's because it could be a problem.
Yes, yeah, and that's what it's going back to, understanding first, and not assuming anything.
So Jenny's actually just answered the next question, which is, can HRLocker provide a template policy for remote working, which she's put there. But also, just on another side of it, we do have the linear integration now with theyre yourselves as well, which is a lovely place for people to go to get all the advice in terms of the templates and the HR side of it, which there's the link that people should be seeing on their dashboard now if anybody wants to talk to either ourselves or to theyre as well, just to go through. We can explain what that is, but it's a nice place to get some advice on that. And then the very last question, I promise, is we ask employees but give them an option if they don't wish to give us that information. Is this okay? So the information I presume they're talking about is it must be around the vaccine, I'd say. Yeah, so they're asking for the information, but it's not mandatory.
Yeah, and again, I suppose you go back to what the Data Protection Commission is saying. Well, what are you doing with that information? Yeah. And it's if it is, well, I just want to know because what? Like you can't retain data that you shouldn't be retaining. Arguably, it's sensitive data about someone on a personal level, or if someone says I didn't get vaccinated because of an illness, a disability, or something like that, or their religious beliefs. Now you've got other information that you actually don't want to have a lot of the time, and you can't unknow it either. And you mightn't retain it, but if it's sent to you in an email or a form, it was received at something. So you have to go back to what's the purpose of knowing it or retaining it through the data protection lens. And
like you said, now you know it. It's hard to say that you've forgotten it if there's any.
Well, you've never forgotten it, and you might genuinely forget it, but the employee knows they told you, and in 12 months' time something happens, and it comes up, and you're saying, well, no, we didn't make a decision, anything to do with that. You say, but you did, you were aware. Now, again, if you know something about someone's status, if they have a disability, knowing it means you can provide supports. Not knowing it, it's difficult to provide any supports as such. So I know there, look, the last point, and I know we've ran over a little, so like look through the future of work lens. There's as much opportunity as there is risk for employers, but there's equal amounts of it there if you're not proactively looking ahead, weeks, months, as to what you should be doing from an employer perspective. Make informed, timely decisions. Don't wait for someone else to make that decision for you. Make the decisions. The worst thing to do is not make a decision and not communicate it out. And I would say there's more change ahead for organisations as PUP schemes get removed, as restrictions get eased, as organisations see what the demand is or isn't. There's a lot of change ahead, more legislation coming in. So organisations really need now to be, I suppose, as aware of everything that's happening and the changes that are going to happen. And as you mentioned there, Chriselle, on our Linea platform, we have a whole COVID hub, we have a health and wellbeing hub, we have FAQs coming out of every area in terms of, because we're constantly updating it with this sort of information, such as what the HSA are saying, what the HSE are saying, to help inform employers about what they need to be looking at. Yeah,
and I would definitely encourage people just to have a look and see, because there's a nice way, because so much change is happening, and there is without a doubt going to be so much change happening in the next 6 to 12 months as well. So thank you so much, Derek. I really hope people found that they're really helpful. I certainly did, and it was lovely to see so many questions coming in. If people want to get in touch, we'll send these slides on anyway afterwards, and the recording as well. So the theyre human resource management information is there, and then as well in terms of our own HRLocker information. So please, if anybody has any questions that we didn't get time to ask, please send them on to us, and we'll try to get answers to yourselves as quick as possible. And so, as I said, we will send a recording of this webinar as well with the slides and the downloads, and definitely link to that article, Derek, that you mentioned in terms of the new data protection in terms of the COVID, the vaccine tracker. So thank you so much, everybody, and hope you all take care. And we'll certainly send you out the next details as well for the next webinar. Thank you, Derek.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.